some effort is put in to isolate, where and when this dialect split happened, and then it will feel more like a genuine explanation and not pulling a rabbit out of a hat. Now that's a sort of slightly different. That's answering a slightly different question than the one you asked, which is, if we have to invoke dialect variation, maybe dialect variation is enough, and we don't have to distinguish between these different phonotactic types of preinitials. And I think that's an excellent point. Yeah, we should only have as much machinery as we need and not any more. Okay, so now on to morphological speculation. So Baxter and Cigar reconstruct 7 morphological affixes. The prefixes S, capital N, M, T, K, an infix R, and a suffix S. Yeah, okay. Okay, so first, tight preinitial, now for morphological reasons. So all researchers appear to concur that S had a causative function in Old Chinese. I think I sent out this handle article, but I certainly can if I didn't. And then Baxter and Cigar propose this causative function, valence increasing on verbs. And they also have a prefix that derives circumstantial nouns, so nouns of place, time, or instrument, from verbs using this S prefix. And they employ etymological arguments in favor of an S prefix origin of the following Middle Chinese initials. And I don't know, maybe I will read them. So S, SR, Z, T, S, TSR, TSH, and TSRH. Okay, so the valence increasing S. We have things like tun, rise of steam, so to rise intransitively, and stung, to lift up, to save, to present to. We have nak, to speak frankly, and snux, to complain or to accuse. It's not so obvious that that's valence. No, it is valence increasing, isn't it? Yeah. It's not really causative, but it's valence increasing. Then we have tongue, to match or have a value or rank with, and stang, to estimate, so to determine the value of. Gi, to look, and ski, to show. Okay, good, nice. Now the circumstantial noun prefix S. So we have rak, to go against or reverse, and then snorak, the first day of the month when the moon changes from waning to waxing. So like the thing that reverses, or the not the thing that reverses, even that would be the moon. The occasion where the thing reverses, yeah. And then we have hlong, to penetrate, and slurong, window, the place where light penetrates. But notice that there's this R infix that is left unaccounted for. And I hope it's just clear to everyone. Like, we don't know that these things are pronounced this way, right? It's the Middle Chinese relationships in terms of semantics and phonetics that are being explained by the supposition that you have an S prefix and the sound change in question, right? And then, these sound changes in question are buttressed by the xiesheng evidence we looked at earlier, but these examples are morphologically motivated, even if, as you see on the first one on the slide, that sometimes they also coincide with xiesheng evidence, right? Okay, now continuing on with circumstantial noun prefix S. So we have mang, to flee, to disappear, to die. and sang, mourning or burial. So, an institution or an object associated with death. But notice that the first one, flee, disappear, is type B, and the second one is type A. So it's not, in this case, it's not just an S prefix, it's also a change from type B to type A. And that's kind of quite interesting. There are, other examples of, let's say, morphologically related words, one of which is type A and one of which is type B, but which suggests that at some level in history, the type A-B distinction was segmental. Yeah, I think that's what it suggests to me, at least. They don't have any explanation for this kind of alternation, but do flag it in the book as like kind of, I don't know, the frontier of etymological research in Chinese is to really systematically look at these A-B alternations. But for our purposes here, it's just let's say, a confounding factor in the analysis of the S circumstantial prefix. And then we're not talking about loose pre-initials, here now, but I just want to throw it in there because it's also this circumstantial use of the S prefix, this example of to take or use, let, and the handle of a plow or sickle, an instrument for holding or an instrument for taking, solet in their reconstruction. And those are all of their examples of circumstantial noun prefix S. Yeah. Okay, so now we're going. That was just sort of setting up the. Oh, look, it's these are the kinds of morphological relationships or semantic relationships for which we posit these morphological relationships. And now we're going to look at it from the phonological perspective. So on the basis of etymological arguments, Baxter and Cigar reconstruct STS and STSH, let's say, as origins of S. So let's look at it. So STS, we have set, joint of bamboo, and sit, which is knee. So, looks like they're etymologically related, and maybe knee has an S prefix. I will mention that this word meaning joint, including of the body, it has very good Sino-Tibetan cognates, but without, I don't know, or those cognates I know of don't have an S prefix. Not that that argues against an S prefix in Chinese. I don't think it really does. In a very early moment, this is one of the earliest sound changes, ik and it merge, and they merge as it. If you just look at these Middle Chinese, your temptation would be to reconstruct it as, sit, and that would be totally fine. That's like totally fine in their system. But and I even think in the Shijing, generally speaking, you can't distinguish it and ik, either because there just aren't enough rhymes or because the sound change has already happened. So this is a really tricky one to distinguish, and they do it based on xiesheng series. And then the next one, claw, which is through, and then scratch has an S initial, and you scratch with claws. So this might be the valence increasing one. But these are not without difficulty. So ni is not an instance of valence increasing or circumstantial noun. And then they also mentioned that this R, it doesn't come up in scratch, the R medial. Okay, so now the aspirate version, we have clear, cheng, and star, which they etymologize to that which is bright. and they acknowledge that there's, again, this difficulty that the one is type B and one is type A. Okay. And this proposed pair of cognates would not be so compelling, I would say, because of the semantics, right? It's like, okay, star is bright, I guess, but not all stars are bright, or it just seems a little far-fetched to me. Yeah? But there are dialect, so Min dialect supports an initial TSH in the word for star. So that suddenly makes it go from seeming like quite speculative to, I think, a very strong proposal. Okay. Now we have this other cluster. We're just going through the clusters. So on the basis of the following pairs of words, they reconstruct, I don't want to pronounce it, but SQHR as one source of SR. So place and place. So without further discussion, this derivation, to me, looks kind of unconvincing. But notice this line from the Odes, where we are chopping trees, and we say we chop trees, hack hack. Yeah, where the first character is used for the chopping sound, and then it's quoted in the entry for the character Swo, the second character, in the Shouwenjie with the second character in place of the first character. So this suggests that let's say that at one point these two characters had very similar readings, or at least that both of them were sounds that could be used for the sound of hacking at wood. Yeah. So I think that philological evidence bolsters the idea. Okay, now one of the one of the more complicated proposals, SMT goes to Z. So they think, as evidence of that, you have place, to place something, and then this mat, so a place for putting things. And you need the M in order to get the voicing, right? Yeah, that's why you need the M there, phonologically speaking. But they do not account for a morphological function of the M prefix or the R infix in the word for place. So yeah, so then moving on, we've already looked at this example, but the point here is that this relationship between look, see, and show argues for this sound change of S, G to J in type B syllables, and I believe only before front vowels. Okay, now we have this pair, and this one is a little more tricky, right? Because you have to posit this intermediate step. So ascend is tongue, and increase is thung, and then they propose that this tsa initial, because we know it's etymologically related to a ta initial, began life as sta. Okay. And then something similar here, where there are two readings of this character, one that means blame and one that means demand payment. And the one that means blame pretty straightforwardly goes back to trek, but the one that means demand payment straightforwardly would go back to tsarek. But then they think, well, because of the etymological connection, maybe better to take that even further back to starek. Okay. But I'll just say that from my perspective, the derivation from blame to demand payment is not obviously a case of valence increasing. Okay, moving along. So we have S before a voiceless R. So you have pluck and reap, and you have colorful and color countenance, where you have these connections between tsa and sra. Now, I will just point out that this is there's a lot going on in these examples, and the same a lot is going on in both of them. Yeah, so the tsa origin, which they reconstruct as from sha, is type A, has a voiceless initial, and has a glottal stop. Whereas the sra initial readings are type B and have a final K. So they admit that they have no idea what's going on here, but it may be some kind of dialect variation. And I will mention here that there are other cases of etymological relationships between final K words and final glottal stop words. And I think that is something that, generally speaking, needs more work done on it. Okay. Now, so STH goes to tra. So here we have push away and urge. So tui and tsui. And then I would also say that, if they only had one example of this, like, ST changes to TS, then it would seem very ad hoc and very silly, right? But you see that there are a lot of these kinds of connections in different manners of articulation. So it seems like a pretty, it seems like even if their particular phonetic solution is not right, definitely the phenomenon is real, yeah? Okay. And now, on to pre-initial capital N. And in some ways, this is both the simplest and the most controversial. Maybe actually it's most controversial because it's the simplest, because then it means everyone can understand what we're arguing about. There are alternations in Middle Chinese, like attested in Middle Chinese, between transitive and intransitive verbs. Generally speaking, and all the examples on this slide, they're written with the same character, but they're not always written with the same character. That's a kind of a question of history. Yeah. So we look at the first one. So we have the reading ken, meaning see, and the reading ren, which, remember, probably or almost certainly goes back to a G. So let's just say gen, meaning appear. So we have ken gen, see appear. We have bei, defeat, suffer defeat. We have gui, destroy, be destroyed. We have tuan, cut in two, and duan, be cut in two, and chet, bend, break, and jet, bend. So, and that's transitive and intransitive bend, right? Bend something and for something to bend. So this much I want to really emphasize. Everyone agrees on. It's just a fact, right? If you look at Middle Chinese readings, you have two readings and two meanings of these characters, and they have this relationship where the voiceless is transitive and the voiced is intransitive. Now, I'll just say, for those of you who care, but if you don't, you can kind of turn off your brain for a few seconds. The other camp, basically, on this question is Mei Tzu-lin, who thinks that the voiced form is original and it is made voiceless from an S prefix. And he points to the fact that there are lots of S prefixes to make causatives in Tibeto-Burman languages. But as we've seen, Baxter and Cigar also think there's a good comparison to be made between that evidence in Tibeto-Burman and a phenomenon in Chinese. But the phenomenon in Chinese that they're pointing to is this thing we've seen before of, which is all the places they reconstruct an S prefix for, which is to say, so Baxter and Cigar reconstruct an S causative. Everyone agrees there's an S causative prefix. Baxter and Cigar reconstruct a different situation as an S causative prefix. So they have to, if you like, they also want to, but they have to explain these alternations in a different way. Etienne, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I just have a small question, but isn't it possible that this kind of became productive later on? Let's say like in late Old Chinese, the voiced, voiceless opposition got kind of grammaticalized, was perceived as being a way to create intransitive verbs from transitive or vice versa, and that therefore some of these words could actually be secondary. Is this, I don't know if there is some evidence for this, maybe not, but I would think that this is something that would very easily, once in the language, that would very easily become productive, because that's something you might need to create new transitive or intransitive verbs on one root.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds fine to me, but sort of 2 points. One is the phenomenon has to have an origin point, yeah, which, I mean, you'll agree with both of these points. The phenomenon has to have an origin point, which is to say some of these examples will be old and will have some explanation. And then also I would say that although this is kind of probably the most common let's say syllable internal morphological happening in Chinese, yeah, which is as really uncontroversial that something morphological is going on here. It's not that common, you know. It's not like it's not clear to me that there was ever a moment where you could really apply this across the board. You could take any verb and make it transitive by divorcing it, or any verb and making it intransitive by voicing it. So, which is not to say, let's say, that some examples might be secondary. You know, just to return to something I said on the first day, we can make new strong verbs in English based on analogy, right? But it's not, you know, you wouldn't be comfortable, you know. So even though it's productive in some sense, you know, we can make new strong verbs. We do make new strong verbs. It's not very productive, and that's my sort of intuition about this. It's like most of the cases are probably inherited, even if some of them are secondary, because it never becomes a super widespread phenomenon. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do Baxter and Sagar explain these? So just a sort of historical excursus. Sagar proposes that the Chinese, this is in 1993, what I have on the slide. I would have thought it was 1999, but maybe no, it's an earlier paper, 1993, yeah. Proposed that a Chinese intransitive voicing prefix must have been some kind of nasal. I mean, it's not a crazy idea, right? Nasals oftentimes voice things, but still needs to be proposed. He proposes it based on the high tone min voiced initial in the Chinese loan word be cracked, which, and this, you know, you have to ask the Hmong-Mien people about this, but a high tone voiced initial in Mien suggests proto-Yao pre-nasalized voice initial. So let's just put it differently. In this word, be cracked, which is here, it's the very last thing on this slide. There's evidence that when this word was borrowed into Mien, it had a nasal on it. So that's the kind of starting point for Sagar of proposing that the voicing alternation you see here has to do with a nasal prefix. I will just point out, I think this is the right place to do it, that in the meantime, a lot more evidence inside Tibeto-Burman has come up, particularly in the Gyaorangic language family. They have a kind of a very productive anti-passive voiced nasal prefix. So, and importantly, they also have a causative with an S prefix. So in Gyaorong, you can, like, this is highly stylized, but in Gyaorong, you could have like a verb what's a good verb? Let's try it with bend, yeah? You can have bend is something like, let's say it's penned. is the verb, and then you can have bend would mean to become bent, and you would have spend would mean to make someone bend, something like that. So they have both in Gaorong used for the same things that Baxter and Cigar proposed Old Chinese for. Now, you might think, if you're a critic of this kind of line of thinking, well, is it a coincidence that Guillaume Jacques worked very closely with Laurent Cigar, and that Guillaume Jacques works on Gaorongic, and so are we reading Chinese through sort of Gaorongic colored lenses? And I would argue that historically speaking, that is not correct. Like it's almost seems to be the opposite, which is Baxter and Cigar proposed S for one thing, and they proposed a prefix N for one thing, based entirely on Chinese data. And then it turned out that there were living languages that that exhibited both of those very robustly, which is kind of maybe even great evidence that they were right in terms of it's like the discovery of laryngeals in Hittite or something, which is to say like something theory driven turned out to exist in the real world. Okay. Any case, here's the same slide you saw before, but now with Old Chinese provided in the Baxter Cigar system. So, basically it's what you expected to see, which is to say the transitive is voiceless, and the intransitive has had this nasal prefix added to it. So that's how they reconstruct these alternations. Now, just moving along with this this nasal prefix, it also does some work for them with laterals. So so basically, capital NR, we saw this actually already in the xiesheng evidence slide. Capital NR would merge with L, and then L would develop into Middle Chinese as it would anyhow. Yeah, so it becomes ya in type B syllables and da in type A syllables. So this way they connect, for instance, to flow with to float or swim, and pendants of a banner or cap with pendants of a banner, and exhausted with exhausted, and covet with excess or licentious. Now, what you can say is the morphological meaning of kind of anti-causative is not at all clear in these examples. But what can you do? They've posited a piece of morphophonology, and it will get some work done here as well. They find no reason to reconstruct this before voiceless resonance, which is interesting. Okay, and then we already saw in our discussion of xiesheng series that you can reconstruct an M or a capital N when a velar nasal kind of interferes into a uvular xiesheng series. Well, here we have etymological arguments for the same type of change. And here, at least in the first one, it works in terms of the morphological function that we are proposing for this N prefix. So to frighten and to scare and to be scared are related. And then maybe great and proper or refined are related. Yeah, and as I mentioned, we saw xiesheng evidence for this proposal as well. Okay. Now, I'll just try and whiz through this M pre-initial. So the morphological function of the M prefixes include making verbs volitional, which we actually saw evidence for when we were looking at these two character writings of words in the Shijing, and a human body prefix and an animal prefix. Okay, so in terms of making things volitional, we have a wrap or bundle, and then carry in the arms, prop up support, plant, place upright, put together, be combined, come together, bring together, and then warn and warn or avoid. So their argument is, so I mean, this is a kind of, we have to be careful here, right? Because the phonological alternation in Middle Chinese is exactly the same that we saw in the case of the transitive, intransitive verbs. It's just voicing. But when the voicing is kind of anti-causative in meaning, they reconstruct an N prefix. And when the voicing is volitional in meaning, they reconstruct an M prefix. Now they have reasons for distinguishing that N and that M, but it's just to say that, you know, sometimes the something to be on your toes about. Sometimes in their system, a phonetic difference is motivated entirely on a semantic basis. Okay, and then here just with aspirates, I'll just look at the third one. So earth and sacrifice to the spirit of the soil. And then with voiced initials, and this one is even more sort of subtle, because the voicing effect of the prefix is unrecognizable when it acts upon voice roots. So let's say, if you want to caricature their behavior, when a character has two meanings, one of which is non-volitional and one of which is volitional, they posit an M prefix purely on the basis of the volitional reading, you know, with no evidence of phonetic difference, at least in principle. You have to be on guard against that as a risk. Yeah. So just to look at, let's say, well, the first one, even and make even. Yeah, the only difference there is volition. Now, in the second one, yeah, there are two readings. So it's not, you know, but that has to do with the tone. There's no reason to point a posit different initial. But let's say, having kind of said, you know, this seems awfully speculative, which is certainly what some of the reviews said. In some cases, they have other evidence, like dialect evidence and loanword evidence, for making this distinction. The question is, even if you can make the distinction in some cases based on other evidence, does that permit you to make the distinction when the only evidence is semantic? And that's a kind of you know, philosophy of science question that I think people could genuinely come down on different places with. So now just continuing, so we have this alternation before L. And this example is problematic because the M doesn't seem to have an obvious function, and because the lateral is voiceless in one case and voiced in the other case. Okay, and then I'll stop with the animal prefixes, where you can have multiple readings of a character that refers to an animal. So they point in particular to frog and to a certain kind of bird. And they think that, you know, this alternation can be explained with an M prefix. And then they also have it for fawn and for deer. And in the case of deer, there is evidence in this this Buyang, which is I think a Kradai the language, seems to have borrowed the Chinese word for deer, and they borrowed it with an M prefix. So now, kind of, yeah, there's evidence for this M prefix in some animal names. Personally, I feel uncomfortable with what's going on here, because, like, well, okay, so you have a word for frog, which was orak, which is a great word for frog. And then you decide, oh, I'm going to stick an M prefix on it to make it more clear that it's a frog. Well, then what's the difference between the two words for frog? And it just, I don't feel comfortable with these animal prefixes. And there's also body part prefixes in Sino-Tibetan. And I would like to see more parallels of them. And actually there is, you know, I really got into into a sort of a tussle with, I mean, privately with Guillaume Jacques about this once, and he pointed out that there is some kind of b morpheme in a lot of Indo-European animal names. So let's say there are analogical phenomena where you can kind of make words seem more similar to each other because they're semantically related. They can kind of lead to things that sort of look like animal morphemes, but they're not derivational. You don't say, like, oh, this is the frog that's not an animal without the M, and this is the frog that is an animal with the M. So I feel kind of uncomfortable in this area. But let's say once again, the evidence is real, right? These different readings of the character in Middle Chinese are real, and they need some explanation. And this is not a crazy explanation.